Mary has spoken so eloquently about the spirit of Mehel, and like Senator Duffy also alluded to, Mehel is not simply part of our heritage here in Mayo, and I do have to give just a little plug to Mayo in this sense. It is part of who we are. It is reflected in the sense of our, the strength of our communities, the dedication of our volunteers, 60 volunteers here today. That's incredible. Thank you to all our volunteers. The ambition of our businesses, the commitment of our public services, and the partnerships that continue to shape the future of this county. Collaboration is one of Mayo's greatest strengths, and it is very fitting that we gather here this morning to explore how that same spirit can help address the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead, not just for this county, not just for this country, but for our world, the world that we want to see continue to exist and thrive for the generations to come. So today's discussion, I know, and over the course of the conference, will all be very thought-provoking, inspiring, practical, and my hope is that everybody here today and tomorrow will leave with a new sense of purpose, new ideas, new connections, and continued and renewed optimism for what, as Mary said, we can collectively achieve together. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure now to introduce you to our distinguished panel. We have Odile Bolloch, we have Dr. Rupa Marya, and we have Professor John Morrissey. And our first keynote address this morning will be given by Odile Bolloch. Odile is a scientist in the EPA's Circular Economy Programme with 30 plus years in sustainability. She leads food waste prevention initiatives, including the National Stop Food Waste campaign, which we're all familiar with, and Food Waste Charter. Previously, Odile has worked at Trinity College Dublin, CNR in Italy, and Birdwatch Ireland before joining the EPA. So, can you please put your hands together to give a very warm welcome to Odile, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Thanks very much. And I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me here today. I'm delighted to be part of it. And it's something, even though I've come from the very far other corner of Ireland and Wexford, it's my first time this far north in Mayo. So I'm really delighted to be here. And actually, I'm not trying to be sycophantic, but I love Ballina. It's beautiful. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I work in the Circular Economy Programme in the EPA, and I lead our work on food waste prevention. And I suppose the key here is prevention, not management, so we're trying to avoid producing food waste in the first place. And today I'm just going to talk about the role that we have in the EPA in tracking and monitoring food waste and collecting the evidence that helps us to build the connections that are needed to reduce it. And how that measuring food waste provides that evidence. Sometimes you use that then as the basis to connect with people and connect with solutions. So as mentioned, we've spoken about food being responsible for 30% of global greenhouse gases, the food systems. And that's kind of the point that we tried to make with food waste. While, we think about food waste, something that goes into our compost bin, hopefully, it's actually wasting the resources that are gone in to make the food in the first place. So there's more to food waste than wasted food. And the key here is, on its own, it's responsible for 8 to 10 of global greenhouse gases, but it's all the embedded resources, the land, the use of the land, the water, the fertilizer, the farmer's time, and once food is wasted, all of that is wasted too. And in fact, it's the food at the end of the supply chain that has the most impact on the environment, because you've got the transport, the refrigeration, and all of those other things that we don't really think about. In a lot of cases, even the food has been cooked, it's been stored and cooked and thrown away. So it's a very serious environmental problem, and as part of that, the EU have developed regulations to help take it seriously, basically. So Ireland actually have obligations to reduce food waste by 2030. And they're actually binding targets now that have arisen from the Waste Framework Directive, which gives us that extra impetus, and 2030 isn't that far away. Just in terms of the amount of food wasted in Ireland, it's currently standing at about 700,000 tonnes. It's really interesting because I've been speaking about food waste since about 2010, and everyone I speak to, nobody thinks they waste food. When you start talking to people, oh, well, we don't waste an awful lot in our place. You know, we don't do this, we don't do that. It adds up to 700,000 tonnes, so someone is wasting it somewhere. And in fact, as you can see, it's all along the supply chain. And this isn't about pointing fingers to a particular sector, because as we know, all the different sectors are linked. So sometimes a practice in one part of the supply chain can impact on another. And this is, I suppose, what we're trying to do is just create the data to help us identify where the problems are. So as you can, and not only that, but the data is quite young in kind of gathering it, so it's improving in quality, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, and also, the more you look for food waste, the more you find it. So we'll probably see it go up before it comes down, and I think that's kind of, you know, we often get compared to other countries in Europe as well, and sometimes, you know, we're higher, but we're actually better at finding the stuff. We're actually really good at waste data. So it's just, I suppose, don't get too hung up on the numbers. I'm just trying to say there's an awful lot of it, and it's all along the supply chain. So we're not kind of pointing fingers here. Just in terms of our role in the EPA, one of our main roles actually is to report national statistics on food waste. So my colleagues in the waste statistics section have been gathering data officially since 2020 now, and they're reporting to the European Commission, and this helps to kind of start that serious tracking and monitoring. As well as that, we're also responsible for developing a standardised methodology for the food business sector. And this was, back to yet again, making sure that we're all measuring the same thing, talking about the same thing, and bringing about that consistency of measurement, because it's only through this kind of annual review process that you start to understand a bit more about what's happening in your company. It initiates conversations, and it also just helps improve the data quality, as I mentioned. Even within a business, the more you look, the more you'll find or understand maybe data that's missing or how you could improve data, things like that. And then we initiated the Food Waste Charter, which I'll talk a little bit more about that, and developed some guidance for businesses in the sector as well, just to help them get over that initial, well, there's the ambition to do something. Sometimes it just takes, what do we actually do here? What's the most effective? We also already mentioned our stopfoodwaste.ie, which is our consumer-facing campaign. I think it's really important. Obviously, it's really challenging to change behaviours with just awareness alone, but it's what I like to call the hearts and minds piece. You have to keep people talking about food waste, and people can identify more what happens in the home, maybe more than kind of what businesses do. So it just keeps the conversation going and gets people thinking about it in a different way. And then, most importantly, as a science-based organisation, we also gather evidence and insights. And as I said, that's kind of from the data. It's also behavioural insight, and it helps us inform the actions and monitor progress ultimately as well. So just in terms of tracking and monitoring, like, why does measurement matter? Well, as I mentioned, on an organisational level, it helps them understand a bit better what is being wasted, where is it being wasted, why is it being wasted, and also the cost. Kind of, once you have the data, you can start to put some financial value towards it as well. And then it also, if you're doing it in a repetitive and consistent manner, it starts to show you whether you're getting any better at not wasting it. Also, from a national perspective, by improving how businesses measure their food waste, ultimately that'll improve our national statistics as well, and we'll get a much more accurate picture of what's going on. And ultimately, as we know, what gets measured gets managed. And then, of course, once you have the data, that actually drives efficiency and innovation. Like, better information can improve your processes. You find out there's an issue. It could be a machine that's just cutting something slightly off and it just needs maintenance that you hadn't identified. It can identify opportunities for prevention, how you can actually stop something being wasted, because often a business might be looking, they have this waste that they need to deal with, so they're trying to find the best route for that. And instead of looking up the stream in their process and going, actually, there's something going on here that we need to sort out to stop it coming all the way down here, that we have to deal with it. It also helps identify opportunities for redistributing food, so for donating it through organisations like Food Cloud. So you might have a product that comes out the end slightly off spec, but it's perfectly suitable for eating. It just can't be marketed under the original purpose. Things like that that they might have thought about before. They might think, oh, we don't have very much. But I know Food Cloud can take small quantities. They're quite happy to. And that gives an opportunity then to not waste that food as well. It also can inspire new products. You can have suddenly, there's a company where they had offcuts that were coming off, and they just marketed it in a different way and sold it. And it was just something, they cut it up into smaller pieces, and it became a new product. So that's a great example. And also introducing new technologies. There's obviously AI, but even just monitoring, you can have cameras on fridges, maybe stopping if it doesn't close properly, things like that. So there's lots of opportunities there, and ultimately that brings about efficiency in the business. So it's actually it's a really strong business case. So just to tell you a little bit about the Food Waste Charter. So the Food Waste Charter is a voluntary initiative, and it brings together food businesses along the food supply chain. We first established it in 2017 working with the retail sector, because at that point in time, everyone was pointing towards the sector going, look, they're in the middle of the supply chain, they're responsible for food waste at the top of the chain and the bottom of the chain. And it was really important. We actually got 5 of the 6 main retailers in Ireland come into a room together and talk about food waste, which back in 2017, nobody really wanted to talk about it. So in 2023, then we extended it to the whole supply chain, and we launched it. We were really, I suppose, proud, because it was signed by 2 ministers, so Minister for Agriculture as well as Minister in the Environment Department, which is, kind of recognising it crosses a lot of different briefs, and our own DG as well. But more importantly, it was also signed by 5 of the state agencies that support the food sector in Ireland. So we had BIM, Board Bia, Enterprise Ireland, FUT Ireland, and Teagasc. And I suppose for the EPA, that was kind of, it was a new type of relationship that we might have had with those organisations. And the idea, what we've been working on with them since we launched it, is embedding food waste prevention in what they do. So they're offering supports to businesses, they're out there offering their supports, and because of that, they're now talking about food waste prevention. They've got grant aid, which might have traditionally been for refrigeration or climate or energy, and they're going, you can use that now to measure and monitor your food waste. So as I mentioned, just measurement tells us what's happening, and then the Food Waste Charter creates those connections that can turn that knowledge into meaningful action. We connect the data, we connect people, and then we can also connect solutions. And we're working with people. We have subgroups that we might link with. We might bring, the bakery sector together to talk about common issues. We might bring in another sector with that if there's something that needs to be looked at there. And I suppose the key point there is that food waste is a system-wide issue, and it can only be addressed through that cooperation and shared learning. And obviously the evidence is really important. That has to be the facts. This is the problem. We've got the evidence to show that. So often the challenge isn't the knowledge, it's the connection. And just very quickly, just to talk about the behavioural insights work that we do about food waste at home. Yet again, we recognise nobody sets out to waste food at home. It's just part of our everyday practices where, plans change, we buy too much, we don't use it on time. So we've been developing we've been doing a lot of work on behavioural insights to understand a little bit more about why these things happen. And it's helped us to frame what we're doing and recognise sometimes you can have these very lofty ambitions asking people, oh, do you know what, we all need to shop in farmers markets and only, buy organic. And sometimes that's a challenge for everyone. We have to recognise that not everybody is at that stage. And we have to get really, really basic, like open your fridge in the evening and see what's in there that needs to be used. So behavioural insights connects that knowledge with the action that we ask people to do. So just finally, I suppose to reflect, our work on monitoring food waste highlights just a very, very simple challenge is often not knowledge, it's connection. Robust data and measurement are essential, but they only deliver value when they're linked to people, decisions, and solutions. By tracking and monitoring food waste, we're gathering the evidence needed to understand the problem and identify the opportunities for prevention. Ultimately, food waste monitoring is not just about counting what's thrown away. It's about creating a shared understanding, aligning efforts, and building the partnerships needed to move towards a more efficient and resilient circular food system. Better measurement creates better connections create less waste. Thank you.
Odile, thank you very much, and right on time, so that definitely deserves another round of applause. So we're going to hold on all the questions until each of the speakers have given their presentation, and I hope that that's okay. I think we'll have a better discussion using that approach. So our second speaker this morning is Dr. Rupa Marya. And Rupa is a physician, activist, and composer. You're going to give us a little tune? And formerly at UCSF. She founded the Deep Medicine Circle and is now an adjunct professor at Trinity College, Dublin, advancing food sovereignty and liberation medicine. Co-author of Inflamed with Raj Patel. So Rupa's talk this morning is on Farming is Medicine in Ireland, Healing Whole Systems. Rupa.
All right, I gotta hold the mic like this because that's how I know how to hold a microphone. There we go. So go Rev Magit, is more in the Nor de Ave and show. Is Misha Rupa, is Dr. May, is Os and Punjab Mohwina. Tamin Erin Lemo Fashti, Ag Uber Ersan Agwech Shinsher. I want to invite all of us for a minute just to close our eyes and think of our ancestors and invite them here into this room with us so that we can listen, so that we can hear them whisper their rebelliousness, their courage, their hope, their prayer for us, and so that we may do our work in their honor. So I am here in Ireland working to uplift the ancestors of my children. They came to the United States after banging on the colonizer a little bit over here around the time of Angkor Tamor. And they left Ireland during an ethnic cleansing, what's called immigration. They left Ireland during a genocide, what is called a great hunger. So I'm going to use words today that are clear because I'm a physician. And if we don't use the right words or the right diagnosis, we'll be going off in circles giving the wrong prescriptions and the wrong treatments. And some of the words are hard for people to hear, but it's really critical that we have the courage to speak clearly. One of my friends, this is a beautiful image by an Anishinaabe indigenous artist, Christy Belcourt. She did a lot of the work for us at Standing Rock, where I served as a medic, called by Native elders, who sat me down and talked to me about colonialism and health, and who educated me through their love. It took a lot of tears, but there was, at the base of everything, love. And the words and the things I'll share today are from their wisdom. Which button goes forward? That one. Okay. Backwards. Forwards. No. There we go. So their wisdom and knowledge is what I'm going to be sharing, combined with all of the learning that I have had the honor to carry from all of my patients and all the conversations, all the listening to land and people I've done over the last 25 years as a doctor, as a touring artist, and as a lover of Mother Earth. So this, sorry, pardon my French, clusterfuck right here, this is what we are up against. This is a structure. This is not bad, evil people. This is a structure. And it's a structure that's driven by greed and the will to power. And it is a structure that was innovated here in Ireland before it was exported all over the world. And it went to my homeland in Punjab and caused the forced displacement of my parents so that I grew up in California. A Punjabi Californian is a dangerous thing when it comes to language because we get very clear and accurate. But dynamics of supremacism, white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, you can call it Protestant supremacism, Hindu supremacism, Jewish supremacism, any system that puts one group over any other in a world that is actually based on a complex, interrelated relationships of beings, the web of life, is going to cause a sundering, it's going to cause division, it's going to cause harm, and ultimately it causes inflammation. Inflammation of the planet, which we all get to experience right now. You actually have to water your garden this week in Ireland, which is shocking. Inflammation of our societies. I arrived here a year ago on July 12th, Marching Day, got to see racist bonfires of brown people burning an effigy on a boat. I quickly learned that the people burning those bonfires had ancestors that formed the KKK, burning crosses in Louisiana. So these structures and systems and ideas are tied together in a worldwide web that is causing harm, division everywhere we go. So to confront that is what we need to do. And to confront it through food is probably the most healing, beautiful way we can do it, because it can bring us back together, as former President Mary described as in a mehil, in a coming together. And this idea of inflammation is not a metaphor. So when I was touring around the world, I would use music as a vehicle to see who was sick and how they were sick. And I quickly learned that in societies structured through colonial oppression, you saw a very specific syndrome of diseases. There were diabetes and heart disease. There were alcohol use disorders. There were suicide, depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's. There were autoimmune diseases. And I started to call this a colonial syndrome. And what we now know, and the science has showed us, is that these are all diseases where the chronic inflammatory response is driving tissue inflammation in the body. What is happening at the cellular level on every replicating cell is that cells that are exposed to a myriad of toxic exposures, can be everything to starvation of your ancestors, dispossession of land, PTSD, could be anything from working the night shift, not being able to sleep in the rhythm that you're supposed to. It could be exposure to excessive heat. It could be debt. You see damage inflicted on our replicating cells. Now, the inflammatory response is the body's natural response to damage or the threat of damage. And so when the damage, when the injury is healed by the inflammatory response, it goes quiet. The inflammatory response is our way of restoring homeostasis to the body. But when the damage keeps coming, the cells get injured and injured, they accumulate injury. And that accumulation leads to a early aging or early senescence. And when cells are aged through damage and they go into early senescence, they take on a phenotype or an expression called the SASP phenotype. And that SASP cell becomes a factory of pro-inflammatory markers in your body. And we're finding these SASP cells associated with all of the diseases of chronic inflammation. So in breast cancer, we're finding SASP cells creating localized inflammation in the breast tissue. In atherosclerosis, strokes, and heart attacks, we're finding these cells in the lining of the blood vessels. In diabetes, we're finding these cells in the pancreas. So this damage is not just theoretical. It is ultimately what's driving the bulk of diseases that I saw as a hospital medicine physician. So for myself, when I look at that and think, okay, well, what are the structures causing this damage? It's not in the hospital. It's not a drug I can give you. It is upstream. And so that's when I started working on food systems. This is the food system today that was innovated here in Ireland when the British Empire removed the structures that were set in place for thousands of years of how people cared for land and forest and each other, and instituted instead a state of private property, plantations, and feedlots, turning Ireland into the lumberyard and feedlot for empire. Those structures persist today. So if we look at the food system, and this is the same food system in India that the farmers were protesting, this is the same food system in California. I work closely with California Native people to get land back into their hands so they can reawaken their ancient systems of relating to food and to each other and to land management in a way that is anti-inflammatory. So through the farming practices, the damage to the soil, damage to the food, damage to the people, this food system is a pro-inflammatory food system. I don't have time to go into all of it, but you guys can attend a lecture at Trinity someday and hear about that. This is what we're going to do here in Ireland. So if the colonial food system started here, we're going to end it here. And we're going to end it by working together with health, with farmers at the front, supporting them fully, with people doing land management, with people building community gardens, with children, with elders. And we create a food system based on economic and food sovereignty, where farmers are positioned as the stewards of our health through how they take care of the soil and water, and through how they grow nutrient-dense food. We prototyped this model in California over 3 years. And what we saw is by positioning farmers as the frontline health workers, we saw health of our soils rebound, we saw health of our community rebound, and the health of the farmers and their sense of dignity and place in a community. It's been remarkable to see what we've done. So we call this farming as medicine. Where are we here today in Ireland? And this is some of the just graphs of what former President Marya already shared. So 135,000 farmers in Ireland. Most are producing export livestock, dairy, animal feed. Only 200 farmers serve the dairy market. The domestic market. And only 73 of those are growing fruits and veg. And like everything, so I moved to Wicklow and I made sure I had enough land to be able to put stuff in the ground. Everything I put in the ground is growing like gangbusters. So when people say, oh, the land is just not right here, I was like, I've never seen anything like it. And I come from like the Garden of Eden in California. It's incredible how you can grow food here. So this is a system that forces dependency. As our Palestinian friend, Mahmoud, who was with us, Awad, said up in Donegal, we were touring and talking about farming there. He's from the West Bank. When we're removed from land and when we're removed from the ability to grow our own food, we are forced into dependency. When we're forced into dependency, we're no longer eating of the earth where we are from. We have lost that critical relationship. So 90% of the food that's grown here is sent off the island to global markets, to commodity markets. 83% of the food that people are eating here is coming from abroad. So where are we today? What I find most interesting is that 45% of the average Irish diet is made up of ultra-processed foods. So a lot of the food that's coming in is actually poison. So ultra-processed foods, as detailed by the Lancet report in October of 2025, damage every organ system of the human body. And what do you get? You get chronic inflammation. So if you're looking at the crinkly package in the supermarket and you don't understand the ingredients, more than likely that's ultra-processed food. And so 45% of the average Irish diet is ultra-processed food. That's not your fault. That's a structural thing. It's not made available. The local food is not made available. It's not supported. And so why is it that 45% of the diet here is ultra-processed food? The only other place I've seen look like this is the Lakota Reservation at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge. When I walked into the supermarket there, I saw an overabundance of ultra-processed foods and hardly any local produce. Ultra-processed foods make you sick, distracted, disabled, so that you don't have the energy to resist that first graph, just going and going, extracting from the land, extracting from the people. So building a healthy food system will allow us to reclaim our minds and our relationships to land and each other in a way that builds health. Ireland also has the second highest cancer rate in Europe. 1 out of 2 people. So if you look at this room, half the people in this room will have cancer in their lifetime. That's the highest rate that I've ever lived in. That needs to be addressed, and that's coming from not just the food we're eating, but the food system and its impact on the land with the pesticides, the synthetic fossil fuel-based inputs that are hurting the land and hurting the water. So we need to take that on structurally. How do we change this? Well, the food system is where economy and ecology come together. Economy and ecology share the same root, which is ecos, which means home. Ecology is the study of the home. Economy is the management of the home. Unfortunately, in the capitalist system that we live in, those who study the home and actually create the home have no business, no power to actually manage it. And that's what needs to change. And in Irish, which I'm trying to learn, there's a lovely word called duchas, which I find is a beautiful word because it means not just homeland, but a state of belonging, that the people and the land are one, that the place and the beings are belonging together. And so I feel like duchas is a compass, like a way to help us organize and think about how we do this here in Ireland. In California, what we did is our farming as medicine model had four main tenets. Number 1 is land back. So land was moved back into the hands of California Native people. Land moved out of a private property context. Land moved back into herself. So if we look at the land here in Ireland that's available, there's so much land that's being held right now that could be used for young farmers who are gearing up and ready to go hit the land and grow food for people here to feed ourselves. Number 2 is agroecology, that the farming that we do is coming from a social, political, ecological framework called agroecology. And I work closely with and I'm a member of Talamh Bio, the agroecology farming movement, and I ask that all of you join today. Because whether or not you are a farmer or an eater or a human being who lives on land, it will directly affect you. And we need more of us together in this movement. Number 3 is we decommodify all the food we grow. So in California, we were giving away 50,000 pounds of organic food every year because we understood that food doesn't have to be a commodity. That is something that has been invented 800 years ago. Food is something we do to build our relationships with one another. And number 4 is when we liberate food from that mentality, when we liberate land from that mentality, when we liberate ourselves from structures of oppression in that way, food can actually be medicine. And I, as a doctor, I'm happy to sit and go through your diet with you as an individual, but my prescription to eat a red bell pepper or a zucchini is not as helpful as talking about let's change the structure so that we can all be healthy. And that's where we start talking about food as medicine. Here in Ireland, here in Trinity, I was brought here after being fired from my 23-year position as a professor of medicine at UCSF for saying stop bombing hospitals and speaking out about the genocide in Gaza. I was invited by Colin Doherty to the School of Medicine at Trinity to start thinking through how we innovate farming as medicine in Ireland. We're trying to build a center for land, food, and medicine to engage in radically transdisciplinary research and education. And we're looking to build a top-down and bottom-up strategy. So the top-down strategy is taking the food tray at St. James's Hospital and reimagining the procurement of that food to local farmers. So can we source the food from local food producers, local chefs? We're excited to be engaging in a partnership with the Bose Climate Co-op, building a food cooperative to get that food ready to meet HSE standards. That first top loop is a short food supply chain. We can do that with every hospital and school in Ireland and get that money out of the hands of large multinationals into the pockets of local farmers. That excites you too, right? This is what keeps me up at night. The second part is the from the ground up strategy. So working with community gardens, we're starting to prototype 2 community farms, community gardens at 2 GAAs in Ireland to talk about can food and health be something that the GAA starts to take on, which is very exciting. Okay, all right, so last, I'll tell you about that next time you're at Trinity. Last but not least, since I moved here, I have been eating 80% of my food from Ireland. So I've met my local farmers. I eat more locally here than I did in California, which means in every 5 days, my gut cells are replacing themselves. Every 2 weeks, my skin cells are replacing themselves. Every season, my red blood cells are incorporating the minerals and molecules and magic of this land. Every 7 years, I will become more Irish. So food is how we become of the earth. Food is how we become of a place in a landscape. And food is the way, with duchas as our true, like this, where we're aiming, duchas is how we can start to build a delicious revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupa. My goodness. And learning Irish as well. This lady has lots of time to fit everything in. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And actually, I found the reflection to close our eyes and make a call out to our ancestors very powerful. And what popped into my mind immediately was my grandmother, who would be 110 today if she had continued living. And she used to say, and ultimately teach my brother and I, waste not, want not. And that was the wisdom of a now 110-year-old woman. So, Rupa, that was very powerful. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker is a Professor John Morrissey, who is standing here eagerly to get to the mic. And he is a Professor of Human Geography at the University of Galway. He has published widely in the areas of geopolitics, imperialism, human security, and international development. And John is going to speak to us today on ecological security in our planetary ecosystem. So can we please have a warm welcome, please, for Professor John Morrissey.
Thanks, Joanne. Thank you, and thanks to Laura and to Karen as well. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Mary, for envisioning for us the importance of the meitheal. I grew up in rural Tipperary myself, on a dairy farm, and I remember with nostalgia the wonderful summers, tea from a flask that tastes so much better, and ham sandwiches and all of that. It was about community spirit, but it was also about solidarity, I think. And I think that's why it's so important to, renew the importance here today amongst us all of the importance of the meitheal. Solidarity for me growing up was seeing my father and their neighbours push back against ACOT advisors and to say, actually, overproduction is not what this is all about in this community. It's about saying, we understand the limits of agricultural production here. We have a locally attuned understanding of how the environment should be managed. And I'm, very proud of that looking back, and it's something I think we need to hold on to. I'm going to talk about meitheal today in a kind of an odd way. I'm going to talk about Yindamara, which is an Aboriginal word for something very similar. And I'm going to focus on the life of Judith Wright, who, if I can get this going. The battery not moving in the back, or maybe if you could just push it on the laptop. Oh, okay, there we go. So in 2023, I was working on a climate security project at Australian National University, and I became interested in the indigenous knowledges that were feeding in historically into understandings of climate security in Australia. And I fell down a rabbit hole, in a way, of Judith Wright's archives. I found myself in the National Library really at a time when I should have been working on the other project, so I went back 2 years later in 2025 on a fellowship to really uncover what I discovered as the sort of beginnings, really, of environmental climate action in Australia. And I wanted to tell this story today to sort of give a sense of hope for contemporary environmental campaigns about why it's important to think very critically about ecological security in the context of our contemporary moment. Judith Wright was one of Australia's most famous poets, but she literally fell off the literary landscape in the early 1970s. So I was wondering what happened to her. Well, what happened was she became incredibly committed to environmental activism. She started writing in ways that were beginning to be hidden away by the industrial actors that she was writing against. Her writing, though, and her activism speaks in profound ways, I think, to this conference theme, a meitheal for her time. In thinking critically and productively about the earth, its knowledge, its care, its custodianship, and what I want to explore, its ecological security. Judith Wright was a pioneering voice on deep ecology and environmental ethics. She drew especially upon Aboriginal knowledges and criticised in particular the all-prevailing narrative of human supremacy, which she showed as only a recent feature of human life in its long antiquity. She also brilliantly developed the concept of the biosphere to envision humankind in a wider planetary ecosystem. And she very courageously and with great personal consequences exposed the detritus and unsustainable effects of unregulated capitalism for the planet. So my work on Wright really is about trying to divulge how her work envisaged the then emerging trajectory from the late 1960s of environmental crisis, how it considered the key challenge in particular of communicating a holistic pathway to a more ecologically responsible world. So, give this, oh, it doesn't seem to be working, maybe next slide, yeah. So until her death in 2000, she worked tirelessly in disseminating what she called a new kind of understanding of humankind in an ecosystem of, quote, living processes and interdependencies. She communicated this holistic understanding of the earth in art and education and activism and government policy, in how we should transform and how we should live in the world differently. And this is what I want to concentrate briefly on today, is Wright's correspondence with a then prominent Australian rainforest ecologist, Len Webb, to divulge her environmental vision and draw out what I think we can really instructively and inspiringly gain from. In Wright's vision for human life, human relations, human-environment relations, a repeated theorizing advances an understanding of humankind's position in a wider ecosystem as part of a deep ecology understanding of the Earth. And this is really the sort of first theme in her extended writings that I found in the archives, is a deep ecology understanding, which in many ways is what we in the academy would call critical political ecology in many ways, in seeing humankind in a deeply politicized and interconnected planet. She felt very profoundly a sense of being in a more than human world, and she felt a whole human reality and a deep respect for all living things. And I think she was haunted by the urgent sort of environmental crisis that were being ignored. She noted as well that Australians felt that they were in possession of a virtually unlimited country whose only problems were those of development and progress. And she noted repeatedly the capitalist interests that were politically being reinforced through phrases like economic growth, endless economic growth in particular. She wrote brilliantly about the ways in which the Australian myth resulted in a prevailing political economy in which we're all hooked into a world replete with needs in food, minerals, and energy. The second theme, really quickly, is she had a great concern for the notion of safeguarding the future of the planet. In academic circles, we call this futurescaping, but she was writing about it in the 60s as a really important way in which you communicate precarity, way in which you can communicate urgency, is to talk about the future, talk about future generations in particular. And she identified the biosphere as an essential concept in thinking through how to become, quote, fit managers and maintainers of the planet. She wrote of a new need for understanding and that recognized the planet's interdependencies and humans as subordinate to its laws. She wrote a brilliant piece in 1969 called The Battle for the Biosphere, where she really just inspiringly identified the ways in which holistic understandings of the Earth can result in how we govern the planet differently, which I'll come back to in a second. The third, really briefly, important thing that we can glean from Judith Wright's life is her really savvy understanding of how to communicate necessary climate action. And in many ways, what my work on Judith Wright is really about is trying to historicize successful campaigns that worked, where communicating precarity, communicating emergency, and we all know how difficult that is in a climate security fatigue world. People don't want to hear, how do we communicate it? Everybody was talking about this over dinner last night. We're all overwhelmed by the world. We're led by populism. We're led by impoverished leaders. And I think it's so important to actually action ways from the past that actually were successful. And, Judith Wright wrote brilliantly about this. She wrote about how do you, avoid being preachy in particular, in ways that engages communities, engages voices in a shared capacity, like here today. Okay, Wright was particularly concerned with the persistence of fossil fuels. I may not have much time, so I'm going to really fast forward through this. In Jean-Baptiste Frezos's more recent book, More, More and More, he offers the first systematic history of energy transition and explains really well why so-called energy transitions operate actually without replacing each other. He reveals the persistence of their ongoing entanglement, and he outlines, for example, how over the last 2 centuries we've burnt more gas, more oil, and today we burn more oil and wood than ever, 2 billion cubic meters of wood. In other words, in transition theory, climate change calls for a change of technology rather than a change of how we live and how we govern and how we regulate. And Wright wrote about this in the 1960s, and she cautioned against the notion of the technological fix. And she certainly saw the destructive effects of capitalism, but crucially understood too the dangers of allowing it to become unregulated, all in the name of prevailing discourses like endless economic growth that are bereft of ecological responsibility. Between 1854 and 2010, 90 corporations were responsible for 63% of global CO2 and methane emissions. These are facts. That's almost 2/3. I think, and echoing the notion of focusing too much on the individual and not looking at the structural that Mary talked about, I think we need to stop blaming an undifferentiated humanity for the climate crisis. We need to expose the capital sectors, institutions, and decisions that have so profoundly damaged the planet. We need to go after them, actually. And that's exactly what Judith Wright did in saving the Great Barrier Reef over 7 long years, protracted Royal Commission testimonies and so on. And that Great Barrier Marine Reef Act from 1975 is now in its 38th legal iteration, which is depressing, I suppose, in lots of ways. But it's, in other words, it's a check on new efforts to drill oil in the Great Barrier Reef from Clive Palmer, I think his name is. So that's ongoing, and she wrote about that as well, really well. She talked about the active citizenry that is needed. I'll just really quickly mention this. I got involved in this UN report as a consultant on human security in 2021. We produced this report. It's about 200 pages or so, and it's really a how-to-do conservation, ecological security in really very instructive, clear ways, including nature-based solutions, what do we resource, what do we actually get behind governmentally, and so on. But what really struck me, and I'm going to really try and speed this part up, was my biggest learning in delivering the report was seeing a little bit of indifference, certainly reluctance, and actually fear in UN circles of taking on vested interests that are opposed to regulatory economic powers. Corporate interests, in other words, that have an implicit never-ending objective of making production cheaper, access easier, and profits higher. I think every metric, as we all know, of our ecosystem alerts us to, if you go to the next slide, if I can, to the extent of the anthropogenic emergency that we face. The overlapping planetary boundaries warnings have been well known since the 1930s by the WHO. The core challenge of transitioning, I think, to a more ecologically secure and sustainable planet centers on documenting capitalism's excesses and navigating out of capitalism's global circuits of deregulation, extraction, and destruction. And I think in strategizing to secure the ecological future of the planet, questions of governing responsibility and accountability are key. And how do we activate those frameworks of responsibility and accountability? Well, I'm going to give you one really good example of how Judith Wright sought to do it. She wrote what's referred to as a national estate, absolutely brilliant overview of how to manage the Australian landscape. It's over 400 pages long. There are brilliant chapters in there on what we need to resource, what we need to do educationally, how do we use taxation. I think that's one of the problems on the left always, is we don't articulate what we want. Well, she does this, and she does this with expert knowledges, not just within the academy. She went out to 700 sites around Australia, and the collaborative knowledge that feeds into this report is really astonishing and so inspiring. But the part that isn't inspiring is there are 3 copies of this in the National Library of Australia. I had one of them out for the summer of 2025. The other 2 were still on the shelf. I think these are the kinds of how to do conservation, how to do ecological security reports that need to be disseminated widely, educationally and so on. Okay, I'm just going to fast forward through this. It's about not being a pacifist, which I think is really important. She refused ultimately to be a pacifist, and I think this is the really important part of Judith Wright's story. She really went into a very difficult time when industrial forces really came up against her. She effectively didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature on 3 occasions because of opposition, various forms of opposition. She suffered enormously, in other words, on a personal level, for standing up in ways that I think really, you know, anybody who's involved in environmental activism understands. There are big pressures, and I think in her work and in her writing, she talks really, really well about refusing to be a pacifist, ultimately, and continuing the struggle despite everything. And I think that's one thing that is really important in her life. And if you could just fast forward it on, yeah, it's the wrong presentation. I think the guys have. Anyway, this was way shorter. Sorry. Okay, so really quickly, I'll finish with this. It is about not ignoring the facts for Judith Wright, and I think one of the things which she did really well was she outlined the importance of simple, clear messaging. And she did this in a way where she focused on really straightforward concepts like ecological overshoot. And the thing about ecological overshoot, and it's just a really simple concept. Sorry guys, could you just give that another one? Yeah, so ecological overshoot happens when nature exceeds what's available in any given year. It happened last year on July 25th. It just happened last week here. From that date forward, we literally run out of resources, and methane emissions, deforestation, etc., increases. And I think communicating these kinds of straightforward, these straightforward sort of stories are really about focusing in on a concept that's instructive, that tells us why it's important to stop and consider what overproduction really looks like. And finally, just to conclude, I think Judith Wright's work is really important in a public scholarship sense. And this is really what, universities everywhere talk about: civic engagement and engaging communities. And I think this is why this event is so important for us as academics. I got news just last week that there was a $1 million project that's supporting the digitization of Judith Wright's environmental writing. And it's so heartening to know that, because I think it is about disseminating stories from the past that have been successful in environmental campaigns. She led courageously, not just the Great Barrier Reef, but in anti-mining campaigns, anti-wood chipping campaigns, industry pollution campaigns, First Nations land rights campaigns, and so on. All of those stories are in the archives. I think we need to elevate those stories more and more and more. I think we need to say why they're heroic, why they're important, why they're instrumental, and what we can learn from them in really, really instructive ways, in how we can reprogram how we live and govern. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.